everyone to reconnect. All right, so hello everyone. Welcome to the PIDC 2021 Demo Debate and Judge Test Debate. I am Gabi, the Deputy Tournament Director for the Philippine Intercollegiate Debating Championship. I'd like to ask the participants of the demo debate to introduce themselves, starting with Government Bench. Please go from Prime Minister to Government Whip and state your POI preference as well.
Hello. Speaking first at Government Bench as Prime Minister and also as reply will be Marco. No preferred gender pronouns. POI preferences through voice.
Hello, I'm Paulo Gabica, Deputy Prime Minister. POIs, just interrupt me. Pronouns your day. Thank you.
Hello, Francis Vendiola, Government Web. Pronouns she and her for POIs. Just put them in the chat.
Okay, thank you so much, Government Bench. Opposition Bench.
Hello, Aiane Gramatica as Chair of Opposition Bench. That will also be right. I have a need for pronouns, and I prefer to take UIs through chat. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Maria, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Preferred POIs through voice, just interrupt me please, and my preferred pronouns are she and her. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Vincent, and he, no preferred, he, him, and at the same time for POIs is through voice. Thank you. Opposition.
All right, thank you so much, debaters. So let's start. Debating on the motion, this House would ban inheritance, calling on the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Hello. May I just confirm that this is clear and audible?
You're audible.
Okay. I will not be turning on my camera. For POIs, please use voice. You can interrupt me, but don't badger. I'll be taking you before the 6 minutes. If there are any, preferably please raise a POI between the 5th and the 6th minutes. I will be taking you during that time. Let me just set up my timer. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. This is the reality in the world right now. And it's not because the poor aren't working hard, it's primarily because wealth and any opportunity to be financially mobile is saturated within the elite few, to those who are able to afford basic goods and services, to those who have been born in a well-off family. What is the stance of Government Bench? Simple. We think that we will be banning any form of inheritance in all levels. We think that this isn't just about the value of money. This transcends other forms of assets, including intergenerational wealth like land properties and whatnot. We think that at a point in which we allow for further inheritance in Opposition Bench, we just create further divides, we exacerbate socioeconomic disparities, we ignore the poor, etc. I'll expound more in my arguments. The model in Government Bench is simple. We think that all of your wealth will go back to the state, and the state will be the one redistributing it among individuals in society. We'll explain in our arguments why the state is a better actor, but firstly, right, a preemption from opposition for Opposition Bench. We think that they'll probably argue that, these are things that you work hard for, and these are things that you want to be able to ensure for your children that they will have a guaranteed future. Two levels of analysis. Firstly, this only works again for the elite few and those who are rich, because we think that the ability for you to be able to work hard also ties back to your connections, to your limited resources and whatnot at the end of the day. But secondly, we think that in the long term, even if you do have some level of guarantee for a good future, we think that your future is still dependent on how society society is established at the end of the day. We think that society will still be affected by things such as like high poverty rates and whatnot. Opposition needs to engage with this. The question of the debate is simple. We think that this is about where we ensure economic and financial stability, not just on an individual level, but also on the grander scheme of things. Two arguments, therefore. Firstly, on why the principle on the right to inherit is non-existent, where I'll be discussing the harms of inheritance, right? What is the premise? We think, coming from government bench, that inheritance is something that's fictional, because in status quo, we think it's not the case that you worked hard for something, therefore you deserve it. The reality is that it is a result of your privilege and the conditions that your ancestors have had to go through, which paved the way for you to be able to get into that position to begin with. 5 levels of analysis. Firstly, on the concentration among the elite few, elite few. Look, this is, I think, an extension of class behavior, right? We think that inheritance is something that primarily caters to only those who belong to the upper echelons of the socioeconomic brackets. Opposition might say that, well, we worked hard for it, we should be able to dictate where we want this wealth to go. We think that this is untrue, because the problem with this is that it only serves selfish interests. We think that if opposition is going to question why exactly we think the government is going to be a better actor on our side of the debate, the same harm applies to them. What makes them think that the wealthy and rich individuals on their side of the debate will be able to care more about the society than the governments in status quo? We think that what happens in opposition bench is that these rich individuals will only be focusing on how they will be able to propagate their surnames, on how they will be able to expand their companies and corporations at the end of the day. We think that this is primarily harmful because it creates a saturation within society that these things are only accessible to them, that if you have this certain kind of surname, then you are already fit for that kind of position, or you will be promoted to CEO and whatnot. But the second level of analysis is that it hinders social mobility. Look, the analysis is simple. We think that opposition is just relying on the birth lottery, right? But what they don't recognize is that this actually limits the power within those who are already financially well off and are already capable of buying things that can satisfy them at the end of the day. We think that it hinders social mobility precisely because the poor individuals who cannot even buy food on a day-to-day basis will never have anything to give to their next generations, will not have anything to like impart to their to the younger parts of their families, precisely because they don't have the resources, they don't have the privileges to be able to afford resources to begin with. And the third level of analysis here is on the dynamics between the two, right? It widens the disparity between the rich and the poor. This is where I discuss the interactions between the rich and the poor. The reality is that, for example, even in politics, there is what we call the Padrino System, right? Like even government politicians are able to pass down their terms to their younger individuals, or positions are passed on to like people who have the same surname as they do. But even in corporations, we think that if you have, for example, connections to a CEO, it makes it even more likely for you to become promoted, or for you to become like someone who receives higher wages or higher pay than the rest of the workforce. We think that this is bad precisely because it paints the picture that the rich will always be the ones who will be on the upper hand of the weighing scale, and the poor will never have the same access to opportunities as they do. Which leads me to the fourth level of analysis, how this creates an over-reliance on wealthy roots and ancestors. Look, in opposition bench, you breed complacency among younger generations because you don't let them realize the value of hard work. We think that for a vast majority of instances coming from government bench, millionaires and even billionaires, right, feel like accumulating that very own wealth is very attainable with hard work and discipline. But we think that this is not the case, right? Like even in developing countries, if you work your ass off, you're still not able to get the same levels of opportunities and access to resources as the rich individuals, precisely because you are other than society, or precisely because your ability to climb up the social ladder is something that is already impinged on the moment you are born. Which leads me to the fifth level of analysis on leaving out minorities. Look, in developing countries, and this supports the birth lottery argument, right? In many countries, such as developing countries, it doesn't matter how hard you work or how disciplined and frugal you are with your money or your income, because there will always be things outside of your control. Talk about, for example, things such as oppressive regulations, like workplace conditions or lack of legislative support and safety nets within the workforce, etc., that deprive you as a poor individual to ever climb up that social ladder, to ever prove yourself to be as worthy as of receiving higher pays like rich individuals individuals in your workforce. You don't get any of this in opposition bench precisely because the poor individuals will always be classified as people who are unable to compete with rich individuals. The tieback of this first argument is that we think that inheritance is just a really bad thing, a harmful thing that not only harms the poorer individuals, but also harms the dynamic and the interaction that we will ever have in society, precisely because the rich individuals will still have to live amongst these poor individuals at the end of the day. What is the second argument? Why do we think that the state is a better actor, right? Let's engage with the worst case that opposition will probably push against government bench, right? What if the state is a bad actor in this debate? One, we think that the harm is going to be parallel because in opposition bench, what makes them think that private actors and individuals will be a better off actor than the government, right? We think that governments are better actors precisely because of checks and balances mechanisms that exist in status quo. 4 levels of analysis. Firstly, we think that, the governments can always be capable of doing things like progressive taxation. But secondly, we can always vote politicians out. We think that at a point in which we see that government actors are bad, this gives us more reason to not vote them in the next elections precisely because we see that they don't use our money and wealth for our own benefit. But thirdly, they are always at the center of the public eye, which makes them more vulnerable to public scrutiny. But fourth level of analysis is that in developing countries, institutions are weak and democracies are weak. We think it's exacerbated in opposition when the wealth is saturated to only the elite few because these people will want to stay in power. Therefore, they will want to get the votes of the people on the ground, also including these poor individuals. For all these reasons, propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Calling on Leader of Opposition.
Hello, can I be heard just fine?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay, I'll just get my time. POIs through voice. Through chat, I'm sorry. I don't have any preferred tone. I'll just arrange my paper. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. One thing to take away from Leader of Opposition's speech is to tell you that we are not against everything that government bench or prime ministers try to propose in this round. That is to say, we are also against rich accumulating a lot of resources that they don't need and they cannot even spend their entire lives, Mr. Speaker. But second, we also agree that poor people should be better off in both sides of the house. I think they have yet to respond to their converse of this round, right? I don't think Prime Minister is able to argue to you how would the rich people necessarily react to that type of policy that you have under government bench, right? That is why the clarification for opposition bench is simple. We think that we will not ban inheritance, and we would rather enforce better progressive tax systems to the rich people and to have better labor laws under our model if government bench is so concerned about poor being exploited on both sides of the house, right? We have two standards in this debate. The first, I want to be able to argue how individuals should have agency over their private resources, Mr. Speaker. This also goes to the rich people. But second, I want to argue, and this is a direct response and clash to their model, right, that redistribution is problematic and harms the poor people even more on their side of the house. And I'm also going to deal with the comparative, right? But a few clarification. I think this debate works on a system where the government is functioning well, Mr. Speaker. That is the fairest assumption of this debate. There shouldn't be any argument about government being bad and all those types of things, right? But yes, let's try to engage to the previous speaker's contention, because what Prime Minister told you in his whole chunk of argumentation is this simple terms. He told you, that rich people are not doing hard work. They're just exploiting the benefits by birth lottery, Mr. Speaker, because at the point in which they are already born, they already have the access to all these types of things. When they are born, they can already be the CEO when they grow up, Mr. Speaker, and they don't have to do any hard work to this. We think that in opposition, we will not argue and contest to this characterization, right? We concede that this birth lottery that they are given is really existing in both sides of the house. But we think the most essential question government and opposition bench should answer in this debate is how rich would react to these types of policy that exist when you ban inheritance in government bench, right? We think that the question we should answer is how do we make conditions better off for the poor, especially if banning inheritance is a threat to agency and to the the resources that rich have, and we think that the people who are going to accept the brunt of the policy of government bench is the poor people, right? On my contentions then, why do we think individuals should have agency over their private resources, even if they are really rich, like even if they are rich people? I think it is on the principle of agency of individuals, right? We think that government bench should have defended this, like what is the state principle on their side of the house, but we're going to do that in opposition bench. We think that the principle of the state is to say that states should only be a facilitator of the choices that we have. This means that the state cannot constrict the choices that you have on both sides of the house. This means that the state cannot like have direct account or direct hold on the assets that you have, on the like the money that you have, Mr. Speaker. But the state principle should be that the state should make sure that rich people with huge intergenerational wealth will be taxed accordingly to their production or to the money that they have, because we know that rich people create more like environmental problems, and necessarily that tax goes back to become to better environmental laws. We think that the policy that government bench has in this particular debate is that that policy in of itself threatens the agency of the rich people. And we think that if you threaten the agency of these rich people who are capable of pushing off under their model, because right now they are at the mercy of rich people, because they can just tell you that all the resources of the rich are either way going to poor people, so might as well let's just exploit them, right? But second, I think that agency is better practiced when poor people do not accept the brunt of this policy, right? This means that like when we do taxation as our counterfactual on our model, rich people are not at the mercy of poor people rather are not at the mercy of rich people, like having all the resources and just listing off the resources, right? This is where the second argument is pretty important. The second argument is going to tell you how the redistribution of wealth as government's policy tells you and inheritance to poor people is very problematic, because how does the redistributing to the poor looks like? We think that it creates more anti-poor narrative, that poor people are number one just benefiting from the money of the rich, right? But second, their policy looks like poor people will be seen more as leeches who are dependent on the money of the rich, legitimizing the nuance that they are really indeed lazy and they need to pay that off in hard work. So what's the real impacts of this? I think the implication of this argument is to tell you that exploitation to poor is more harmful on their model, because now poor people in government bench is worse off, because number one, because now they will see you as someone who is under their mercy, Mrs. Speaker, that sooner or later you're just going to exploit their resources after this, I promise. But second, you have to repay them as poor people in the hard work, as how rich defines this hard work to be. This means that they will create a narrative that they own you right now, because at the end of the day, you're going to exploit their resources, because their resources will be redistributed to you, right? But yes, POI.
If you tax the rich people higher now, 5 years from now, they will still be the ones leading corporations. They will still be the ones in office. How will the poor ever climb up the social ladder on your side?
Wait, the question is not how poor people will become CEO, because I think that's really impossible to do in both sides of the house. You cannot even prove that on your model. The question of this debate should be, where are the poor people better off? I think they're better off with the taxation narrative that we have, the counterfactual on opposition bench. And why is it particularly better? Because taxing the rich is a universal language. Because number one, by virtue of social contract with government, you have to give tax because you voted to them, and because these taxes goes to like government policies and affirmative action that necessarily still benefits you as rich individuals and poor people, right? But second, we think that we also tax the poor when they like buy services from the government, when they buy goods, and when they do these types of things, right? We think that this is ultimately a better alternative, because right now we can create a better government policies that targets poor and vulnerable people, like for example, like government subsidies, like scholarship for these poor individuals. So the point of this argument and the takeaway of this argument is to tell you that right now poor people will not be seen as people who are just leeching resources from rich people, and they're not seen as people who are really lazy and just dependent on the assets of the rich individual. Very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition. Calling on the Deputy Prime Minister.
Hi, can I get a minute? I'll just drink water. Is it fine?
Hello. Yeah, it was just a bit muffled, but
All right. Okay. I'll just drink water. Sorry. I'll
Alright.
be back. All right. Okay. I'm back. Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you're audible.
All right. Cool. Starting my speech in. Wait. Sorry. In 3, 2, 1. In my speech, I'm going to talk about three things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why inheritance is generally bad for everyone. I think this is a very important debate because if we prove why the people that will benefit from this will not actually have those perspective or generally just subjective benefits that opposition will have, will actually get off it, will not actually be given to these poor people anyway. We think that we win in this debate. Also, secondly, we're going to talk about why exactly this is bad for the economy, why the entire state will not flourish if we have these taxes or we have this inheritance in the first place. But before that, let me just go to few responses, right? Firstly, I think we are just going to take off from their principle of agency that people generally have the right to what they do in their with their property. I think the opposition does not really see the impacts of this because if you allow this principle to just generally be like on there available for rich people, I think rich people will just continue to exploit with whatever resources they have or just forward much more money because you allow them to do so because they have the agency for them to do so. But secondly, I think the principle of agency only actually actively happens when the person have an agency to do so. So who are these people that actually will give inheritance into? I think these people are already dead. These people don't have the agency for them to actually apply this certain behavior or certain mechanisms to how their money or real property will actually do so because they're already dead because they cannot generally decide on how these certain things will actually happen. Like dead people don't have agency generally because common sense they're dead. But even if they're alive, agency is still a problematic avenue to have these forces with because agency is very muddled. Agency even in you are living are very much affected by lots and lots of factors like emotions. Agency is very much affected by subjective preferences, racial prejudices, for example. So we really don't think the issue of agency here is actually very much poignant in a way that opposition tried to do so. But even if that would happen, we also talk to you about, especially the prime minister's speech, how the state is the best actor, especially when they have this legitimate concerns of these constituents. They are the best actors to provide what this policy would actually look like. But secondly, also secondly on their second constructive of how this policy will get the narrative that poor people will just generally leech off from the money of the rich. And I think this is just generally bad because I think opposition has to consider the fact that already the rich people are being leeching off of these poor people in the first place. I think it's just right for them to take back what they have. But secondly, it's actually much better in our side of the house because the poor people will actually get the money that they deserve in the first place. At least in our side of the house, even if they do argue from that, even if the narrative is very bad, we actually give the poor people the money or the remuneration that they deserve in the first place. So we think it's just a win-win situation that opposition did not really just provide in the first place. First extension then. Why inheritance is generally bad for everyone? I think we think that usually inheritance establishes an unfair advantage, especially those who are already privileged. This is true for three reasons. Because number one, because you already born them out of privilege in the first place. That means you take them out of their societal functions they would have gotten if they didn't have inheritance in the first place. You would think that rich kids would be much more sensitive to social issues regarding about classes, but no, all they get is that all we have are rich kids who do TikToks that doesn't really care about social classes because they think that they're already safe especially that they have generational wealth coming from their parents. But secondly, you propagate this inequality to these children because you think that social class and status is reserved by those actions of your ancestors. I think this is already talked about by Prime Minister. But thirdly, because you make these children fight for inheritance in the first place. It is not very uncommon for us to see that families and close siblings fight to death due to properties that are divided unequally to them, especially when you have inheritances become much more prejudicial based on subjective preference of those parents. We think that this will continuously happen on their side of the house because inheritance will continuously generate prejudices or generate fights about the siblings that will tackle them for. So they have to defend that how inheritance taxes generally creates much more conflict. Secondly, then second extension then, yeah, PUI, go.
How about when there's a middle class who have like just enough inheritance they would want to give their family? Are you really going to remove that agency from them?
Like generally, yeah, if you're already middle class, you're already lucky enough to actually have money to start with in the first place. So I don't think that generational problem, if you already like, I don't really think that that will be a problem to you because you already have certain capital to start a good life in a middle class way anyway. So I think especially, but also just generally inheritances. If you have inheritances, that means to say that you already have enough money to start up a capital or influence yourself to actually boost more in your life. So I really think that would be a problem. So why is this bad for economy? I think, look, one problem we have with inheritance is because we want more and more money to be hoarded so that you can establish intergenerational wealth. Why is this so? Because rich people, because number one, rich people are greedy. Also, you want your future to be comfortable. Therefore, you justify this continuous wealth hoarding. Why is this bad? Number one, because you'll justify the hoarding and that rich people will hoard and hoard more money, even to the extent that you exploit lots and lots of people. And because you think that inheritance will just generate you, because you justify that to say that the families that you opt to take care in the first place should, for example, be comfortable. So you just exploit more money, even to the extent that it's already unethical. But also, secondly, you don't allow money or riches circulate the economy. You just make it stagnant because you don't allow it to be put forth into certain services or investment. You don't allow it to go to the states so that they can have this great money. You only allow it to be stagnant there. And this is the problem, right? Because there's certain multiplier in economy, like one certain dollar can circulate for the whole country and circulate more and more times when it's actually more used. So when it's actually just growing there hoarded, simply for inheritance, that means that money isn't going to be captivated or generally be going to be productive in a way that the state and the people will actually use in the first place. So therefore, it's bad for economy. We don't really know why is this exactly one of the ways where you should actually just prove that they will actually have a return into. Therefore, we think that inheritance is something that's generally bad. It creates much more conflict. Also, secondly, it's generally bad for the state because you don't really get to use it in the best way. We're very proud to post. Thanks.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Calling on the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Here. Am I audible?
You're audible, yeah.
Okay. Give me a few seconds to set up my timer. Timer 7, 6 minutes. Okay. Okay. I'll start my speech. Again, for POIs, please say it through audio because I will not be looking at the chats. I got disconnected, so I missed a lot of things, but that's okay. Start in 3, 2, 1. Living in a world similar to the platform movie, wherein the rich eats buffet at the top, and at the bottom we have the poor people not even having scrapes of the food, right? There's a bigger need to close that disparity between the rich and the poor. However, regardless if this intergenerational wealth is earned or not, right, as argued by the government, opposition argues that banning inheritance would only make the social economic gap bigger. I will explain that later on in my constructives. Now, let us rebut first and have a direct clash on the points given to us by the government, right? 4 points here. First one, how the rich individuals did not necessarily work, or how, in this intergenerational wealth, this people did not really earn this, right? And so the idea here, or their solution here to the problem, is to completely ban this intergenerational wealth, just redistributing it to the poor, without given mechanization of how this long term, of how this mechanization, right, of how this policy would affect society in the long term. And there's also this idea of how this would raise complacency among the rich people. However, we disagree. In fact, this would actually cultivate this anti-poor narratives wherein people or how the stigma wherein the poor people are actually dependent on the rich people, right? Or how the poor people are more complacent, wherein if we redistribute this money from the rich directly to them, they're basically like leeches to the society, right? And that is not good if we're really trying to close the gap here. And they talk about, we need to consider, panel, how there's no clear boundaries given to us by the government, right? How they talked about how even in the middle class, right, there's enough. If you have intergenerational wealth, they're going to have like enough capital to like start anew. But there's really no justification, because if in their mechanization you're literally going to just redistribute that kind of money, right? And that's going to harm not just this, if their target is the people at the top, they're also going to trickle down the harms to the people at the bottom who's only working hard, really hard, for them to actually give something like some sort of security, monetary security for their children, right? And that is not really fair. And the issue about continuous hoarding, and how these funds, if we don't do something about it, right, this funds will not be utilized. The funds of, or the money of the rich will not be utilized for the to solve like the problems for the poor and such. Is actually addressed by the policy by the policy proposed to us by the opposition, right? But I'll notice how there's no clear analysis from Gov, and how banning inheritance and redistributing this money affects society in the long run, right? So there are two issues that I'm going to solve later in my speech. First one is in the notion of helping the poor. I will prove why banning inheritance would do more harm than good, especially for the people at the bottom, right? And the second is on regulating the rich. I would justify why the opposition's paradigm is better in trying to solve this disparity, trying to close this gap, right? So what is opposition trying to do then? We think that we believe that the state shouldn't interfere with the citizens' autonomy to actually to manage their finances, right? In fact, we give a better alternative, and to give the state the ability to actually give, wherein opposition policy, wherein you give like progressive taxations and such. And I will explain later on why this is actually better on funding for the people, right? And it's not just like a one-time money. It's going to be a sustainable solution to the problem, and how this would be the best alternative for the actor involved in the long run. Now, before I proceed, yes, POI.
In status quo, do poor people make enough money to secure their children's futures?
No, exactly. So in your paradigm, you're not going to solve that problem, because you're basically just going to first just going to raise the stigma against the poor, which will actually cultivate worse working environments if these poor people are going to work under the rich, right? Because it's going to widen the social disparity. And so you actually don't give enough opportunities for these people to actually earn a sustainable living, for them to actually give good life for their children, to actually give them a better chance for a better future, right? You don't get that at the government. You only get that at the opposition. Let me prove that sentence then. At my extensions, let's have a long-term assessment of what government's paradigm would look like, since we didn't get that from them. Now, 2 points here. First is, how would this paradigm look like in the middle class setting, right? Since since the government did not give us clear boundaries of how this mechanism would work, this could literally affect not just the people at the top that they're targeting, but for the people who are working 9 to 5 jobs, who are earning or barely giving into their luxuries. We see luxuries and such because they want to earn for their children, right? For them to actually give intergenerational wealth, even for not just too big for the middle class, right? To actually give these children like of college, their children college funds and such, to actually give them security for them to have like a secure future. And that is not, if you take that away from them, you're basically taking away the opportunity for these children to have a better future, right? And so this social disparity and the issues of social disparity, as discussed by the leader of opposition, how this would really raise the stigma against the poor people, right? This would actually push anti-poor narratives, where in society, poor people would be seen as leeches waiting for the rich people's money, right? And that is not really sustainable in the long run, because that is not something that you can continuously go. That is not passive income, right? So with that, we cast a shadow of doubt on the government's paradigm. They're basically complicating what's already complicated. Now, this is why opposition's policy is better of progressive taxation. And the main idea here is we utilize this kind of tax, wherein we actually give enough intergenerational wealth for these rich people, right, to actually continue their companies and such, to give, because this actually offers job to the poor people, and we actually use these funds to utilize these funds for programs such as improving schools for the poor people, improving public schools, giving scholarships for the poor people, giving ayuda for the poor people, wherein they actually utilize that money for businesses and such. So this kind of funding, right, would be utilized by the government for programs that will actually give these poor people something sustainable, something that they can get from, or something that they can use in the long run, and not just on the spur of the moment, right? So this will actually give these poor people the idea, or like teach them how to fish instead of just giving them the fish in itself. So we actually give this chance. We actually, with this, it's the opposition's policy. It is only in opposition's paradigm that we can really cater to the needs of the economy's poorest, right? And this is where they are better off and achieve better sustainable monetary distribution in the long run. So with that, we're very proud to post. For time.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of Opposition. Just a reminder to all the speakers, please do end your speeches and wrap up your points by the 7th minute. All right, calling on the government whip.
Hello. Wait. Okay. Hello, I'm Francis. For POIs, just pronounce she and her. For POIs, just put them in the chat. And starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. In a democracy, we're always taught that people ought to be equal. But sadly, this isn't the case in status quo, which is why we said the stance from government is simple. We should ban the rich from ever passing passing their inheritances to their lineage, so that they will be able to distribute all of those wealth to the people in general. Both sides of the House note panel agree that the most important actor in this debate are the most vulnerable, the poor, the minorities who have been historically oppressed by the system of inheritance. So the main question that we ought to answer in this debate is, which side of the House provides an equitable life for the most vulnerable? There are three things that I'm going to do in a speech. First, I'm going to compare the models, right? Which model achieves that goal better? And lastly, on my two issues, on opportunities, security in life, and about complacency. So on the first discussion about comparison of models, right? Because opposition said that we ought to have progressive taxation. There are three problems with this model, right? Because this is in tension with their principle of agency. Because if they say that we ought to allow people to make their own decisions when it comes to their money, that's contradictory to the idea of progressive taxation. When you tax the rich don't consent to it, right? So where is the matter of agency in there? What does it mean for the debate? It means essentially that in their very own principle, they don't fulfill it. Second problem with their model of progressive taxation, their argument of backlash is contradictory to their model, right? Because if we're talking about backlash, it's going to be a symmetric outcome either way. If they say that we're going to anger the rich because we get their wealth, that's also going to happen on their side because they will steal their wealth through progressive taxing. But thirdly, assuming that they exhibited rigor in analyzing their principles and arguments, the fact that they propose progressive taxation is a concession that we ought to limit the wealth of the rich in the first place, right? So if they concede to this, it all boils down to which model is more effective in limiting the power of the rich. If we look at it, when will tax be more effective? It's when you raise it higher and higher, right? When you raise it 50%, 70% of inheritance tax up until it becomes a 100% inheritance tax, which is what our model essentially is, right? So even if they want to have progressive tax, and even if they get to limit the power of the rich, this only means that we get to limit their powers better. Well, that's on the comparison of models. So on my two issues, firstly, on opportunities and security in life. Because they said that we ought to be concerned about how other people will live. What about the middle class? What about those who have no inheritance to begin with? This just shows, panel, that they were not listening to my prime minister. Marco told you that a total ban on inheritance looks like taking all of people's wealth, whether they be rich, middle class, or poor, which the state will then redistribute to all of society, right? So when we redistribute, we benefit the middle class, we benefit the poor, we benefit even the rich, we benefit all of people, right? So it doesn't make sense if all of their claims revolve around these things don't get to trickle down, because what happens when you redistribute is that these things get to be trickled down, right? They had to prove their converse burden on their side, right? That progressive taxation is enough, that the benevolence of rich individuals is enough to trickle down their wealth. Secondly, all of their characterizations revolve around the poor working hard in status quo, saving up on money. When we POI their deputy, they said that although the poor work hard, they agree that the money they earn doesn't suffice for their needs still. So if you follow their logic, then all the poor on their side will remain that way, right? Working hard and never achieving a commensurate income to their labor, to their labor. So if that's the characterization that's going to bank on, this is likely going to be the future for all of the poor on their side. What do we do in Congress, in government? What we do is we lift up the burden of these individuals to work harder and harder because of the narrative of the oppressive system that you have to work hard in a capitalist system, right? We lessen their burden because we redistribute wealth. We give them money at the get go. Secondly, they talked about building schools and all of these social welfare institutions. But if you look at it, when are these things going to be maximized? When are these things going to be maximized the most? It is when the state has more money, right? And in a comparison of models, we proved to you that by virtue of having a ban on inheritance, we are the world who's likely going to have more money on our side of the house. But secondly, thirdly, when you talk about opportunities and security in life, they were already very unresponsive to the constructives of my two previous speakers. They talked about an unfair advantage brought about by birth lottery, and secondly about how the dead will affect the lives of the living, such that when a rich CEO dies, their nearest immediate predecessor gets to inherit that wealth and gets to inherit inherit that wealth and steals opportunities from a lot of people in society. So what does this essentially mean for the debate? Not only does it mean that they were unresponsive, but secondly, they weren't able to, but secondly, this only proves the characterization, right? That even on their world, if they have progressive taxation, the rich will still have a lot of money. The rich will still have a monopoly on opportunities. Because if they say that they will have like a 50% taxation, if a billionaire with 100 billion pesos in his pocket, how do you do math? Then a 50% taxation only becomes half of that 101 billion, right? Which is still a lot of money. So if we're going to talk about opportunities and giving more security in life for people, we think we do it best what they call this, when you equalize the playing field and no one is left behind. So on the last issue about complacency, because the repeating claim from opposition side is to say that the poor will be stigmatized, right? Never mind analyzing very deeply that even in status quo, the poor are already stigmatized, right? There's already a stigma that the poor don't work hard enough, don't work hard enough. So even they didn't prove how these kind of narrative will be necessarily new. But I say that even if we have this narrative on our side, the fact that we get to redistribute wealth and benefit these people is an overwhelming benefit that it's an overwhelming benefit such that we can dismiss the stigma and the stupid narrative, right? That the poor are being complacent. But secondly, if we're going to talk about complacency, they were already very unresponsive to my two constructive speakers, right? Because if we're going to talk about complacency, the most complacent actor in this side are the rich, right? The rich who inherit money, who don't really get to work a lot because they've already inherited lots of money from their fathers, from their ancestors. Okay, so uh, yeah. Okay, lastly, and pasingit lang na issue. If we're going to talk about actors, right? Necessarily our actor is a state, and necessarily their actors are private individuals. And the fundamental difference between these two is that our actor, the state, although we can agree that state can be bad or can be good, at least you have a degree of assurance, right? Because you have that formal agreement that the state gets all of your wealth and the state has to give it in return. Conversely, on their side, you rely on the benevolence of private individuals to donate and to give. There's no assurance on their side. Very proud to oppose things.
Thank you, Government Whip. Calling on the Opposition Whip.
Hello? Can you give me like a minute for my notes? Yeah, wait. Okay. Preferred POI is through voice by I guess 4:30 or 5. So yeah. Am I audible, right? I'm audible.
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the discussion that we have here in this round is that hey, there is a problem when it comes to the disparity of wealth. Secondly, there's a problem on how does this kind of are we going to manage this kind of hoarding that has happened. All of the sides have conceded to the fact that hey, yeah, there's this kind of problems. But what we have here in the opposition side is telling you that it's not enough that you're going to abolish it truly, and it would more likely to give you a much more problematic backlash. And furthermore, look how the government side is telling you that their only banner or the actor is the state in itself. But what we have in the opposition is a both two ways, a mutual way on state and the private entities existing and having this kind of mutual aspect when it comes to existing. On the way that we mitigate this is to progressive taxation and justifiably understanding the spectrum of wealth within the poor, middle class, and the rich. Now, let's have what are the issues that you're going to get in the opposition side and why we should have the win. First is where do we truly ensure the stability in itself when it comes to economic aspect, political or sociological one on the people in itself, on the ground or even in the rich. And secondly, how do we deal with the inheritance properly? On the first case, on our comparatives, what did the government told us? That hey, there's a great problem that is happening. It's only the state that acts as a messiah. We don't deny that there is a great that the state could be a great actor in this debate. But we tell you that their existence is some sort of a facilitation aspect, like what my first two speakers have said, that this kind of mutual way is through taxation, is through giving you this kind of limitations, but not necessarily an usurping power or overbearing power that the state will be the almighty at all. Because the facilitation will happen as an analysis and through people working hard, or let's say the middle class going in, or at least saving up for something for the next generations that they would have. Because what did the uh, for the context here, what for the context here, what is the contextualization when it comes to the inheritance? It's true that there's a cases like when it comes to your property, to your lands, or even the money. But when, for example, the POI from the deputy of the government telling you that even for the existence of the middle class, they don't want this kind of inheritance, we think that's a problem too. Because they don't understand the spectrum of wealth and at the same time on how this could be mitigated for the bigger or even for the one upper echelons of the 1%. Because what we have here is a dynamic one or a holistic one. For example, if you're the 1%, you have a bigger taxes. If you're middle class, you have a much more lower taxes in itself. Now, because what's the problem here, panel, is how do people handle taxation in itself? For example, Jeff Bezos and let's say Tesla owner, um, let's say Tesla own Jeff Bezos from Amazon and Tesla owner Elon Musk are able to get around the system because they live in the states where are lacking when it comes to taxation and their monetary finances. Those are the problems that we have to address. We don't need to resort into a clear abolishment of the inheritance in itself because there are other better alternatives, just like we told you. Now, what did the opposition give you in this table? We give you that it more likely legitimize the aspect that now the rich cannot have a small inheritance or a sort of inheritance or way. They are more likely to have that kind of exploitative ways in order to earn money. Those are the analysis that pu- we are keeping on or highlighting in this debate. Now, furthermore, where do we ensure the stability in itself? We ensure stability when we manage to put on the state as a facilitator and private individuals to be able to aim and achieve success in itself. Whether you're the middle class or even a rags to riches story, or even let's say um even in a 1% to continue something because that is something of, but you have a jump start ahead. Both of the houses agreed to the fact that there is a problem when it comes to let's say unfair or disadvantage in itself. But the more equitable way is not to truly remove or strip people everything of what they're capable for, because sometimes those kind of hard work, for example for the middle class, is necessary that they want to be at least better off for the day by day and to have a savings in itself, because things are not just like stable in life in itself. Sometimes it would go a rocky way or bouncy financial crisis that they could take, and at least that they have something to save upon. That is the case that's exclusively in the opposition side. That is the case when you, at least when you have this kind of safety net existing. And let me tell you, we're not demonizing these private entities, and we're telling you we're cooperative with the notions when it comes to the state. Now, those are the cases. And are there POI? Okay, go POI.
Yeah,
DPM.
by progressively taxing this rich people of their inheritance in a way that you almost want them to not have inheritance at all, you also agree that inheritance should be banned in the first place. But also, we don't stop them to not enjoy their wealth. I think we just generally stop them to have inheritance.
It's different when you're telling me that when it comes to you don't, since because you want to tax them, it means that you want 0%. No, that's technically different panel, because what we're telling you is you have a disparity of taxation, but not everything in itself. And look at your panel. Taxation is much more preferable instead of banning in itself, because at least in taxation you have a legitimized aspect that hey, it would go to the state, hey, it will be distributed. But when it comes to clearly banning it overall, it's much more likely sends a message that there is a ban in itself and you don't have opportunity or something, especially for the middle class, to at least save up for the next generation. Now, lastly, how do we deal properly in the inheritance aspect? Now, two things here. When it comes to the government, they don't properly mechanize you what is bad when it comes to this kind of inheritance. They just tell you that this because this disadvantageous, because there is this kind of problems it could give you, it means that we should now abolish it. That thing are not enough. We tell you that alternative is better, that there is still at least a way of platform for them to give on to well off, especially even a spectrum of wealth for the middle class. And lastly, this kind of abolishment is not enough in itself. That at least for, let's say, a poor trying to earn up into rags research story in itself, the problem here is how do we deal with taxation? It's not, the solution is not truly abolishing it, the inheritance, but rather we are able to address the problem when we're able to put on there we have a this let's say an aspect on, there would be this kind of percentage for the rich, not truly abolishing it. So that's all for. Thank you. Right, we're proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. Calling on Opposition Reply.
Hello. Can I confirm that I'm not Shopee? Hello. Okay. Just let me know if I get cut along the way again. I'm very sorry. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I think we have to point this out, right? I think government's model is very inconsistent because Prime Minister's model is to tell that they are going to redistribute the inheritance of small groups of elites only. This means that they're talking about billionaires, they're talking about filthy rich people. But here comes government with telling you that, all people will be banned of inheritance. This goes to rich and even to middle class people. I think that is already an inconsistent harm on their model, and I don't think that they can win this round, right? But second, I think that our model is very, very consistent because when we tell you that progressive taxation, when we tell you about progressive taxation, it does not necessarily corrode the agency principle that we discussed a while ago. Because number one, I already told you in my speech that this is a universal language. This means that everyone is being taxed regardless of what your wealth is, but it's more proportionate to what your wealth is, because when you're rich, you're taxed more, and when you're poor, you're taxed less, right? But second, we think that in terms of extent, it's different because on a government's bench, you're going to take away all the resources at the end of the day. But on our side of the house, you're just going to get a portion of that wealth that they have through progressive taxation, right? But third, I think this has a principal justification as lodged in Leader of Opposition's model, because I told you this is by virtue of social contract, because you voted for a state and that state has the right to claim tax on you, Mr. Speaker, because it will be given back to you by virtue of government policies. I don't think they even have a principal discussion on their side of the house, right? Two things to reconcile in reply speech. The first, I wanna tell you how both sides of the house discuss the redistribution of wealth and how do we deal with it, right? In principle and in pragmatics. Let's go in principle. What did government told you in this debate? I don't think they have a principal assessment as to why this policy enables the state to do it and why the state is allowed to do it in the first place. There's no principal discussion on that part of their speech panel. You have to recognize that. And we think that is already in and of itself bad for their model because they cannot claim any benefits. They cannot claim any structural reason as to why inheritance is bad without even proving us why the state can claim inheritance from these people in the very first place by virtue of principal discussion, right? But second, I think they're very afraid to deal with their converse of how the rich will necessarily react to the policy that they have, right? How did we respond in opposition? We told you that the state in and of itself should not threaten the agency of anyone, regardless of your social classification, right? But just be a mere facilitator of whatever resources you have or whatever choices that you have, you ought to do. But second, we also told you that how the rich people will be more exploitative on their side of the house, because right now you see to poor people, because right now you see you peddle more anti-poor rhetoric on their side of the house, i.e. they are the recipient of your wealth at the end of the day, i.e. you can exploit them now because they are you own them, because your money will go to them at the end of the day. In pragmatics, then we think how government dealt with their pragmatics. It's a problem solution mismatch by having this policy, because their problem, as they posit to you, is to tell you that poor people cannot reach higher positions in the social ladder because of inheritance. First, we don't think this has a mechanization how it looks like. But second, they did not really prove how they reached this on their side of the house, especially if we already told you until upwhip that poor people will be more exploited under their model. How did we respond to this claim? We told you that through status quo, this is through better taxation, through better labor laws to protect the poor. This translates into government policies for better funding, for better subsidy and better education for poor people. That's where you better equip them, these poor people, to have better self-actualization and have like the better safety nets to achieve, Mr. Speaker, and the rest of this house. We're very, very proud to take this round. Thanks.
Thank you. Opposition reply. To close this debate, calling on government reply.
Hello, have I been called? Sorry.
Yes, you can start whenever you're ready.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. I was EFK a bit. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. The platform isn't the best example for opposition because recognize that it wasn't the wealthy elite who were at the topmost level. They were also poor individuals who luckily ended up there one day. The wealthy elite were the ones behind that prison system. So if opposition's analysis is to channel their anger towards the people at level 1 of the platform, they're barking at the wrong tree. The first thing I want to clear out of the way is government replies accusation that opposition replies accusation that we're inconsistent because we will also affect the middle class. No, panel, I typed my speech and I'll read my characterization word per word. I literally said ban inheritance in all levels, regardless of socioeconomic status. So do not believe opposition reply. This is how my reply speech will go. Firstly, I'll deal with opposition whip. They raised a POI to my deputy. What if a middle-class individual has enough wealth they want to pass on? I think we're okay with this because our model was clear. All forms of inheritance will be banned, right? But the next thing they said is that we don't demonstrate what was bad about inheritance. Clearly, opposition whip wasn't listening. My first argument was literally 5 levels of analysis as to why it is bad. The next thing they said is that this is about resolving taxation. No, because if that were the case, this debate should have been just about this house would progressively tax the rich, but the nuance of the motion is on inheritance. So government bench hit the spirit of the debate. Opposition didn't. We win. Let's deal with leader of opposition. Their burden push was that we never proved how the rich will react to the policy. 3 levels of analysis. Firstly, we don't care about the rich in government bench. That's exactly why we don't want them to have control over their wealth, right? But secondly, even if opposition never argued this, we think the likely scenario in opposition is worse because at a point in which you tax the rich more, they will be emboldened because these are probably selfish individuals, as my deputy painted, who pride themselves with money. This is bad because then the rich will probably just, exert more effort to be angry about the government and whatnot. But thirdly, opposition loses by the standard of their own principle on agency. At a point in which you progressively tax the rich, that is already something that the rich did not consent to, that is already against their egos, that is already a threat to them. But the second thing I want to respond to from leader of opposition is that they said that the debate works in a system where governments are fully functional. 3 levels of analysis again. 1, this is a clarification that works for government bench. Note that if you buy this clarification from opposition, it benefits our entire case because it means that the state in government bench will be efficient, will be fair, and will be honest with how they redistribute the wealth. I think that leader of opposition just shot themselves in the foot by making this clarification. But secondly, we think this is actually untrue. You cannot assume the functionality of the state in this debate. That's why in my prime minister's speech, I flagged the what if government is bad argument as something that is our worst case. But thirdly, our best case is that the government is good, and buying the clarification of leader of opposition, this will reflect in our policy as the state bettering public welfare services, improving schools, and whatnot. They said they will have better laws. The problem with opposition is that these benefits aren't exclusive to them. We think better laws are things that we can achieve in government bench as well, so all their benefits are co-optable. But the next thing they said is that, agency is better because the poor people are not at the mercy of rich people. They talked about the poor, poor, poor. We think it's not just about the poor. We think it's also largely about where we stop the rich from ever monopolizing the economy and getting wealthier. That's why my POI about the rich still being the same CEOs 5 years later was important. I asked a POI to leader of opposition on how the poor will ever climb up the social ladder, to which they said it's not about that because it's impossible for the poor to become CEOs and that we didn't prove it at government bench. It's untrue that we didn't prove how the poor will be able to move up. At Prime Minister, I said our policy is how we desaturate and rid current institutions such as corporations and government offices of dynasties and Padrino systems. This is how we allow the poor or the middle class to have some sort of leverage because they're no longer hindered by a different surname or a different socioeconomic status. But furthermore, my deputy argued on complacency, right? And how younger individuals in opposition will not be sensitive to issues and just rely on their statuses. But the next thing I want to deal with in opposition bench is their deputy leader of opposition. They said that the poor will be seen as leeches on our side of the debate. One, I think this isn't what our model looks like. They're not waiting for the richest money. My setup was clear. All your wealth will go back to the state and then be redistributed. So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. But secondly, even if that were our model, yeah, sure, we think we're okay with the poor leeching off of the rich, precisely because, again, the rich have always had it their way. The rich have always been benefiting from the poor. For all these reasons, clear government bench.
Thank you, government reply. Debaters, please cross the House. Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you for participating in the PIDC 2021 demo debate and judge test. So for all the judges listening in, please submit your AJ exam answers by July 24, 2021, 11:59 p.m. Again, that's July 24, 2021, 11:59 p.m. through the Google form that will be emailed tonight to all fully paid and registered judges. Apart from this, 2 reminders from the Adjudication Corps. Number 1, please do not indicate your name or institution in any portion of the judge test. And number 2, AJ test results will be announced on July 28th. Judges will be given a day to appeal the results to the Shadow Adjudication Corps. So again, number 1, do not indicate your name or institution in any portion of the judge test. And number 2, AJ test results will be announced on July 28th. Judges will be given a day to appeal the results to the Shadow Adjudication Corps. So with 10 days left, we hope everyone's preparing well for PIDC 2021. Thank you and see you all in PIDC.